Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me today. Thank you everyone at DevSecCon for organising this really great event. And thanks to all of you for tuning in as well. So today I want to talk about Count Up from Zero Day. That's a joke on a book about the cybersecurity industry, which is called Countdown from Zero Day, Countdown to Zero Day. But the idea is I want to talk a little bit about a story about how we discovered that we were affected by a critical vulnerability and how we dealt with that, and maybe some sort of lessons learned based on that. So a bit about me first. Like I said, my name is Josh Grossman. I work as head of security services for a company called AppSec Labs. I've got about a decade's experience in IT security, IT risk, specialized in the last few years in application security. And at AppSec Labs, as the name sort of hints, we're very much focused on application security, and some of my time spent overseeing our consultants who work on penetration testing projects. But a lot of my time is actually spent sort of helping our clients, helping their development teams sort of improve the security of their software and build security processes into their overall development. And that's sort of where this story came from. In my spare time, I also do work for OWASP. I'm on the Israel board of OWASP, and I'm also a project leader of the application security verification project. So feel free to ask me about those as well. But let's dive straight into it. So there I was in my garden. It looks a little bit more modest than this, I must admit. And I was browsing through Twitter during a break from work because my office opens out onto the garden. And I'm browsing through Twitter, looking at what security news there is, and suddenly this pops up. So obviously, when you read through security Twitter, lots of different articles, lots of different vulnerabilities pop up. But this one caught my eye because this one was in a company called ForgeRock, or a product called AM, which I knew that at my client, who we'll call Acme PLC, they use this product inside one of their own products. So I figured, okay, I need to go and take a look at this. So I drilled into the article, and I have to salute the author of the article, because from a hacker perspective, this is a great article, really great write-up about vulnerability, really sort of good walkthrough about deserialization vulnerabilities, a nice bit of path bypass as well. Overall, really sort of slick article from a hacker perspective. But unfortunately, on this occasion, I wasn't wearing my hacker hat. I was wearing my product security hat, trying to protect Acme's products from security vulnerabilities. So I started to look and try and figure out, okay, what's the nature of this vulnerability? What sort of vulnerability is this? So overall, we're talking about a remote code execution vulnerability. That's pretty bad. That means that an attacker can run code on the application server from wherever they are. They can just execute code. It's pre-authentication. The attacker doesn't need a login. They don't need access to the application to be able to do it. All they need to do is see the front pages of the application. That's it. They don't need a user account. This AM product, AM stands for access management. It's an authentication authorization product. That's always not a great sign when your security product has a vulnerability in it. And worst of all, the researcher who wrote the article kindly provided a very sort of clear working exploit of how to exploit the vulnerability in their article. This is bad. Certainly having a working exploit available is one of the main indicators that you're suddenly going to start seeing this exploited all over the internet. This is not a good situation to be in. If we look at how vulnerabilities get calculated, I know there's a talk, I think, later on in the US time zone about more about vulnerability disclosure and a bit more about the vulnerability process, but this is how generally vulnerabilities get their severity calculated, the CVSS score, and from my perspective, this was certainly the highest score, CVSS 10, sort of the worst in all possible ways. The final score was 9.8. Is 9.8 that different from 10? I think probably not. This is a bad situation. So first thing I did was went to try and find more information. I went to look on the database of vulnerabilities of using the CVE number they'd given in the research were given in the article, but there wasn't anything there. Obviously, that's now been rectified, but this is on the day the researcher published. There wasn't any information there at all. So I thought, okay, that's a little bit strange. Let's see what we can find on the vendor site. So I had a look on the vendor site, and they also didn't have any information. So I've got a CVE reference for vulnerability, but it doesn't have any information. It doesn't lead anywhere. The vendor hasn't said anything about this either. They haven't got no information about this either. And I guess the most worrying sign in some ways was the fact that usually when a researcher publishes an article about a vulnerability, at the end they'll publish a timeline saying, okay, I notified the organization on this date, they got back to me on this date, I heard from them again that they were planning a patch on this date, and they released the updated version on this date, and then we disclosed the vulnerability together on this date. This article doesn't have that. Didn't have that, doesn't have that. That's making me think already yellow alert. That's making me get a little bit worried that we could have something a little bit more serious going on here. So we sent an urgent ticket to ForgeRock, who are the vendor, and said, hello, can you tell us something about this, because we don't seem to find any information. I spoke to the product teams who are involved in the relevant Acme product that have been affected, to let them know, okay, something is going on. We don't know exactly what, but we might have to send a communication to our customers or issue a patch or something. And I figured, well, if we don't know anything else about it, but we've got the exploit, let's try and reproduce it. So obviously at AppSec Labs, like I say, we do application penetration testing. So we have a team of hackers who are proficient at exploiting vulnerabilities. So I passed it over to one of them and said, look, here's a vulnerability, here's an instance of Acme's product. Can you exploit this vulnerability in their authentication system? Expected to hear back in a few hours. Maybe it'll take some time. Maybe it was not so straightforward. Unfortunately, it was so straightforward. In less than 2 hours, Mr. eHackerman had got back to me and updated me that, in fact, it was exploitable in the instance that I'd given them, and it took him less than 2 hours to do it, from basically reading the blog post to having a remote shell on that application server. Red alert. This is a big deal. This is a major issue. So what do we do now? Again, we've not had the information from the vendor, so we have to start thinking about mitigations. How can we try and stop this from getting exploited? Maybe we need, the researcher had mentioned various paths, so maybe we need to try and block certain paths to the application. We also had to start preparing to alert our customers. Obviously, we've got a wide number of customers who are using the Acme product that would need to apply their own apply a patch or apply any mitigation. And we carried on pestering the vendor, trying to get some information from them. Finally, a few hours later, the vendor published something, which was already a good start, but certainly 6-7 hours already passed from the original publication of this blog post. And if my eHackerman had exploited it in less than 2 hours, what was the rest of the internet doing? So first of all, they published information, but they only had a workaround. They didn't have a patch. They weren't ready with a patch to roll out to actually fix this. They just could suggest a workaround. The workaround was to make some changes in configuration files, which in some ways, I guess, is easier than installing a patch. In other ways, it's a little bit fiddly, and you need to start issuing step-by-step instructions and making sure it's the same in each instance. It's tricky. It didn't feel like they were ready to release that. The other tricky part was that this affects quite a few versions. Version 6.0, version 6.5, various things in between and above that. And some of these versions are still in support and should get patches. If we look at, but there's also a lot of versions that aren't being patched anymore, that aren't in support and don't necessarily receive patches anymore. If we look at a high level, these are the versions that they support in parallel. So every time they have a new release, they'll have new patches for each of these versions in parallel. And I can tell you that 6.5, in fact, has 6.5.x, 6.5.x.y, and multiple patches and versions going on in there as well. So it's more complicated than just 4 versions. Plus, you've got all these versions as well, which aren't so old, but are no longer supported. So effectively, we have all of these that are suddenly vulnerable to this very, very serious exploit that this researcher has dropped onto the internet. So this is obviously quite a significant event, and certainly within Acme's product, they were using a particular version, this version of their product, but in previous year's version, they might be using an older version. So they suddenly had to start dealing with all of this in parallel. So at least we had a workaround. At least it hadn't taken too long, taken a little bit longer than we would have liked, but it hadn't taken too long. So we were able to start testing that on each parallel supported product version. And again, this is Acme supported product versions. Maybe Acme supports 6 versions stretching back over the last 3 years or something. So this is already quite intense. And we had to send out an email to the customer saying, okay, this is the workaround. You need to apply this. You need to apply this really right now. This is pretty urgent. Obviously, we had to implement this in-house as well on our own instances that we were hosting of Acme's product. And then there was a question of old versions. We had information about the newer versions, but we knew the older versions were vulnerable. We didn't have much more information than that. Eventually, we got some information that said that this workaround would probably work on the older versions as well. So even if the patch didn't get released for the older versions, at least hopefully the workaround would work. But again, that was still a delay, and that was still a gap in which this issue could have been exploited. So in some ways, semi-happy ending. We were able to deal with this pretty fast. We were able to turn this around pretty fast, despite being taken by surprise. But I guess, why did this happen in the first place? So if we look at what the researcher wrote, I like to assume that the researcher didn't intend to cause a big mess, didn't intend to drop a 0-day on the internet, an unpatched vulnerability. I think the researcher assumed, well, the patch has been released, the vulnerability is patched in version 7.0, so everyone just has to upgrade to 7.0 and they'll be fine. Clearly, that's not how things work in the real world. We've got at least 4 parallel versions that are all supported, and multiple subversions within that. People don't just run up to the next major version in the space of a couple of hours. There was a caveat afterwards that they've provided a workaround for version 6, but obviously that was only added to the researcher's article after the ForgeRock themselves released their article several hours later. So I think that this was sort of a misunderstanding about how things work within a development organization, how things work within a product organization. Obviously, security researchers are very, very, very sort of highly skilled at finding security vulnerabilities, exploiting these vulnerabilities, or escalating access. I guess they probably have less background into how a product team works, how a development team works, what's the release life cycle, what versions are supported at any one time. They may assume that, okay, well, this is the latest version, so everyone will upgrade to the latest version. They may not have the concept that multiple supported versions may exist at the same time, and that's what seems to happen here. It's obviously even more complicated if, in this case, Acme ourselves, we are a vendor of software that we bundle this third-party product into our software and then sell it to our customers. So suddenly we have to deal with an upgrade from ForgeRock, and then we have to get that integrated into Acme's product and get Acme's product installed at the customer site. There's obviously a lot of moving parts here before we can consider ourselves to be secure. And at the end of the day, this is as a product company, as a development team, it may fall on us, as the defenders, as the people responsible for securing the product or building the product, to make sure that the security researcher understands all this complexity and to work with the security researcher to actually understand the different moving parts involved. Obviously, I'd much rather that security researchers had more insight into this and sort of more background into how these sort of processes work, but we can't take it for granted. So I guess the summary, what I want everyone to take away from this, first of all, if you can implement a product security incident response process, that's certainly a good process to have, a good playbook to have that you can run through. Say someone's reported a vulnerability, who do we speak to, what do we do, how do we get this rolled out? Have a step-by-step playbook saying, well, how are we going to react to this? In this case, with Acme, we didn't have a formal playbook, but I was obviously very familiar with the different people involved from the product side, from the development side, from the customer side, and was therefore able to speak to the right people and make sure that the issue got progressed and that we were able to communicate to our customers very fast. But having a formal process is obviously better, and part of that needs to be sort of pushing to work with the researcher. We need to make sure that obviously what the researcher is reporting is valid, but if it's valid, to work with them to understand, okay, what's the scale of this, what does it affect, and make sure they understand what's actually needed to fix this. Again, when the research published their article, there was no patch, there was no workaround, there was no communication, there was no nothing. It doesn't necessarily matter whether that was on the fault of the researcher, whether that was on the fault of the product company on ForgeRock, whether that was both. It doesn't matter. That communication has to take place, and it's important to push to make sure that the researcher is going to work with you on that. The other aspect to this, we obviously talk a lot about vulnerabilities in third-party libraries and the importance of doing something like software composition analysis, looking at vulnerabilities in third-party libraries. But that will generally take the form of some sort of periodic scan. Especially in the companies that I see, they'll scan the libraries every so often, and they'll get a report of what vulnerabilities are in their libraries currently. But this was a situation that evolved over the space of a few hours and could very easily be exploited in the space of a few hours as well. I think it's important to have that sort of real-time situational awareness as well, to have some source that will update you as to what's actually going on with vulnerabilities that might affect your product. For me, honestly, the primary source is Twitter. It's a great way of finding out what's really serious and going on. From the vendor perspective, ForgeRock, once they published their advisory, they emailed all of their customers, which is good, but you also have to know how to evaluate that. We get emails from ForgeRock every few months with updates on new versions and security vulnerabilities. How to know when to implement those tomorrow, when to implement those now, it's tricky. It requires some experience. And finally, I guess final thought, if anyone who works as a breaker or works as a security researcher happens to be listening, really do think about the impact of your work and sort of what's going to happen when you release this sort of information. Certainly security research is important and releasing information on vulnerabilities is important. But it's also super critical to make sure that it's done in a coordinated way and a good faith attempt is made to make sure that the fix is getting released at the same time as the bug. So we're not just providing a problem, we're providing a solution. I hope that was interesting and that was provided some useful information. And yeah, feel free to ask questions or either now or offline. I'll answer what I can, subject to NDAs. But yeah, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
All right, Josh. Thank you for this insight on these 0 days. One question I personally have is, it seems that we need to bridge a gap between the security researchers and the development team on how things actually work. What is your opinion on how can we solve this? And there probably is not just one solution, but it's a mindset thing, I guess.
Mm-hmm. No, certainly. I think that there's a wider sort of strategic thing of trying to foster an attitude of if you want to break something, then you really need to know how to fix it as well. Don't just come with a load of broken things. Come with suggestions about how to fix as well. And obviously that depends on how much insight you have into the product and how much you can information you can provide. But certainly, when we're delivering penetration testing, it's not just about here are a load of vulnerabilities. It's about providing practical recommendations for here's how you actually deal with this particular issue. And I've done that in the past as well. I've seen examples where someone has released an attack technique, and they're like, yeah, this is a great attack technique. This is how you can exploit this vulnerability. And I've pushed back and said, okay, well, this is really cool, but what can defenders do to mitigate this? What protection can they put in place? And I think it's important to foster that attitude. I know certainly someone like OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, which is a global organization to raise awareness about application security. And OWASP is very much built around sort of bringing together security professionals, but also development professionals as well. It generally has tracks related to breakers and also builders, and the conferences and the meetups tend to blend both worlds and have them actually meeting and speaking to each other. And I think that's also really important as well. And I think DevSecCon actually does the same thing as well, because it's bringing people who are involved in more the development side and bringing people who are more involved in the security side and making them sort of have these conversations and have these discussions and sort of understand each other's pressures.
Absolutely. If you have any more questions for Josh, feel free to. I think the best way is to go into the Slack and ask questions over there, or ping him directly on Twitter. The next speaker is already away, so I want to thank you for your presentation, Josh. It was very insightful, and I loved it. So thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Right. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.